Greetings, Brookings Bio students. This is Mrs. Rydell, and this time we're going to talk about Chapter 3 and look a little bit more at environmental things going on our planet. And some of this stuff is probably a review for you, since we learn about ecosystems and food chains and interactions of organisms kind of starting in grade school. In middle school, you did a unit on water. Went water testing and looked at some environmental issues. So this chapter we're going to kind of take our organisms that we've been learning about and put them out into the planet. So you got to dust off your bio brain a little bit and remember kind of where we started, where we're coming from. In our very first chapter, way back at the beginning of the year, we looked at atoms and we talked about the periodic table and learned about some different kind of atoms that were important for living things like carbon and nitrogen, oxygen, hydrogen. And then we took those atoms and put them together to make molecules. And we learned a whole lot of molecules that were important for living things. We talked about proteins and carbohydrates, nucleic acids, lipids, and what they do in your cells, in your body. And then we took those molecules that we learned about and put them together to make something bigger, make cell parts. We took phospholipids and proteins and made cell membranes, and we talked about organelles. We did a unit on cell parts and learned all the cell parts: mitochondria, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi bodies, ribosomes, remember that? And then we took those cell parts and we put them together to make cells. And we talked about differentiation, how cells get to be different, muscle cells, skin cells, bone cells, and talked about turning on different genes. Remember, all cells have the same DNA, but what makes them different and which genes that they turn on and which ones they turn on, which ones they're using. In our cell parts chapter, we made a little sequence. So we took cells that are similar and put them together to do a job. Like if you look at this picture up here at the top, these are all muscle cells, and they would make tissues. Cells go together to make tissues. These are bone cells here, and so similar cells working together to do a job would be a tissue. And then if you take tissues and put them together, different kinds of tissues, for example, this is a stomach here, and stomach, if you look inside, there's muscle tissue, there's nervous tissue, all different kinds of tissues. If you put tissues together, you get organs. And you have a lot of organs inside of you. Think stomachs, liver, heart, brain, kidneys. Those would all be organs. And if we take different organs, put them together to do a job, for example, break down your food, you have liver making enzymes that help you do that, gallbladder, stomach, large and small intestine. We would get an organ system. And your body is made up of lots of different organ systems. You have a circulatory system, a reproductive system, a respiratory system, a digestive system. If you put all those body systems together, you get a living thing. Remember what our word for living thing was? You get an organism. So far, we've been kind of looking small, the small picture. Microscopic. What's going on inside your body, inside cells? We looked at molecules, we looked at cell parts. But now we're going to take that organism and look at the big picture. We're going to put that organism out onto the planet, and we're going to continue our sequence. So organisms, when you put them together, same kinds of organisms, same species, living together in an area, like a herd of buffalo or a flock of seagulls, makes populations. Populations are the same kinds of animals living together in a place. And if you look at an ecosystem, if you look out on the planet, you see populations don't just live by themselves, but they live as part of a group of organisms in a place. So if I was to go out in the woods, I would see bear and moose and squirrels and trees, oak trees, birds, owls. I would see, thinking about all the like fungi growing there, bacteria that live in that place. So populations, different populations living together make a community. Now I can keep my sequence going here, and for this chapter you should know this sequence now from taking organisms and building on that sequence that we started way back at the beginning of the year. So if I take communities, think about all of the organisms that live in a place, the different kinds of animals, the plants, together with the non-living stuff that's there, the climate, the temperature, the rocks, the water, I get an ecosystem. And ecosystems include both living and non-living things in a place. Now, if I look at groups of ecosystems that have similar climates, similar communities, organisms living there, I get what's called a biome. And we have desert biomes, forest biomes, grassland biomes. There's similar kinds of ecosystems. Okay, and now if I take all of those different kinds of biomes on the planet, all the places that organisms can live, we get what's called the biosphere, the portion of our planet. So think about where we would find life on our planet. That includes the water, the air, atmosphere, the land. We get the biosphere, and that's what this chapter is about. If you look at organisms, we talk about organisms that are similar to each other as being the same species. And the definition of a species is that these are organisms that are so similar to one another that if you bred them together, let them breed, and produce offspring, that those offspring would be what we call fertile. Fertile means they can have babies of their own and keep the species going. So if you look at these two organisms here, some kind of a African antelope type critter, if you were to breed these two together, they would make a baby, and if that baby can reproduce and pass its genes on, we would say these two organisms in the picture are the same species. So for example, if you take a horse and cross it with a donkey, you get an organism called a mule. And horses and donkeys are different species, and the reason we say they're different species is when you breed them together, the offspring you get, mules, are what we call sterile. They can't have babies of their own. The way you get mules is not to take a mom mule and a dad mule and breed them together to get baby mules. The way you get mules is crossing horses with donkeys. And if you look, the reason that the mule is sterile, can't have kids, is they have an uneven number of chromosomes. Remember, when organisms do meiosis to make sperms and eggs, they have to match up their homologous chromosomes, and then when meiosis happens, each of those homologous partners goes to a different sperm or egg cell. If you look, horses and donkeys have different numbers of chromosomes. So 64 chromosomes in a horse and 62 chromosomes in a donkey. So when the mom and dad, the horse and the donkey, pass chromosomes onto their offspring, remember each parent gives half, the horse is going to give the baby mule half of 64, 32 chromosomes, and the donkey is going to give half of their 62 or 31 chromosomes, and you get a mule baby that's got an uneven number of chromosomes and can't reproduce. So we would say horses and donkeys are two different species because they can't make fertile offspring when they're bred together. Okay, vocab word. The sciences studies this. The sciences studies the interactions of organisms with each other and with their environment is called ecology, and that's what this unit is about. The next unit, we're going to do a couple units on ecology. First looking at organisms and interactions, and then how humans fit into this picture. Vocab word, biosphere. We kind of mentioned that before in our sequence when we made that kind of build one thing on top of another. But biosphere kind of includes all the places on our planet where living things exist. So if you think about where that biosphere is, it extends from the surface up into the atmosphere about 8 kilometers. We have organisms that can live in that space, fly around, or there's bacteria. Once you get up to a certain point, though, it gets too cold and there's not enough oxygen, and life stops existing once you get far enough away from our planet. So the biosphere includes atmosphere up to about 8 kilometers, And then if you took a submarine and went down in the ocean, it's probably about 11 kilometers below the surface, is about as far down as you can go and still find living things. So that would be the biosphere. If you think about ecosystems now, what makes up an ecosystem? Remember we said it includes the biotic things, the living things. Remember bio, that prefix means life. The living things that an organism might interact with, all of the other animals. And oftentimes when I would say, think of a living thing, what would come to mind is an animal. But you have to remember that living things are not just animals, not just us, but think about all the plants that would be in an ecosystem, the fungi, different kinds of little protists in the pond water that might be there, microorganisms. There's all kinds of organisms that live in an ecosystem besides the animals. Ecosystems also include the non-living things. And remember that prefix a or an or ab means not, the not life factors, abiotic factors. That includes things like the climate, the temperature, sunlight, the soil, humidity, wind, all those non-living things. And we're not talking about something was living and now dead. That would also be a part of the biotic factors because it was once alive. But abiotic things are never alive, non-living things that are part of that ecosystem, the place where those organisms are found. Vocab word, habitat. Habitat is the area where an organism lives. And habitat is kind of a description of the place. So if I look at this rattlesnake here, I would say that the habitat of rattlesnakes might be in a deserty place in southwestern United States, maybe Arizona or New Mexico. We have rattlesnakes that live in South Dakota. Out in the Black Hills you can find rattlesnakes. And so your habitat is kind of the place where we would find an organism. Not to be confused with this word. And sometimes people kind of mix those up and use them to mean the same thing, but they don't exactly mean the same thing. It's partly the place that you live. Niche includes the place that you live, but it also includes all of those biotic and abiotic interactions that are going on in that place. So think about the word niche, and we use niche to describe non-ecology kind of thing. We talk about your niche, where do you fit in? So it's partly where you live, but it also includes all of the things that you're doing in that place. What are you eating? Who is eating you? Where in the habitat are you living? If you live in a forest, do you live in a tree? Do you burrow underground? Do you live in a cave or a pond, edge of a stream? And what is it that you're doing there? Are you hibernating in the wintertime or migrating south for the winter? A lot of birds do that in South Dakota. When do you reproduce? How do you reproduce? Do you make a lot of babies and go away and leave them? Do you make one baby that you spend time with and take care of and protect? Do you reproduce in the spring? Do you lay eggs, have live babies? All of those things that are happening in that ecosystem are part of your niche. What are you doing there? So if you think about those two words and how they're different, habitat is more like your address. Where do you live? But niche is not only where you live, but it's what you're doing there. Kind of like your occupation. Who are you interacting with? What are you doing in your habitat? There's a kind of a rule. If you think about organisms that live in a place together, if you have two different species that are trying to live in the same place and do the same thing at the same time, eat the same food, live and make a home in the same tree, you're going to have a lot of competition in organisms fighting each other for space and for food. And so if you describe kind of those interactions and what's happening, scientists have come up with what they call the competitive exclusion principle that describes those interactions between organisms in a place. And if you think about it, competition, right, If you have organisms that are competing for the same place, the same time, the same food, making babies at the same time, they're going to be competition between those organisms, and somebody's going to get excluded. If there's only so many places to live in a tree, and somebody's going to get bumped out. So if you think about organisms, you may have different kinds of birds maybe living together in the same, trying to make a nest in the same tree, but they're not going to do it the same way. They're not going to eat the same kind of food. Maybe some of the birds are going to make a nest in the top of the tree. Some may burrow into the, like have a hollowed out place in the tree where they make a nest. They might be feeding in different kinds of food. Some of the birds may be eating the berries on the tree, and some of the birds might be eating the bugs that are crawling on the bark. And so even though they're in the same place, they may not be doing the same thing at the same time. They're feeding differently, they're reproducing differently. And so the idea that no two species can share the same niche, be in the same place at the same time doing the same things, is called the competitive exclusion principle. If you remember back to our photosynthesis chapter, we talked about the energy from the sun providing energy to do photosynthesis. And really the sunlight is the main source of energy for life on Earth. Is providing the power for all of our producers. And remember, producers are making food and oxygen for the rest of us. All of the heterotrophs depend on sunlight to allow the plants to do their photosynthesis thing. Think back to other chapters in our cell parts chapter. In our we talked about photosynthesis and respiration. We talked about the way organisms get the energy that they need. In some organisms, like autotrophs, we call those the producers. They can make their own food. Most autotrophs use photosynthesis to produce food. They catch the sunlight and use it to make sugars. We talked about that in our photosynthesis chapter and how plants do that. And the main producers in an ecosystem that are live on land are the green plants. Think trees, think grass, all of the things around us that we see that are green, growing in the places where we live. But if you think about planet-wise, some of the major photosynthesizers, producers are in water, are the algae. And the majority of oxygen actually that's produced for us to breathe comes from the algae that live in the ocean. If you think about our planet, we have more water surface than we have land surface. And so algae are big photosynthesizers. But not all autotrophs, not all producers use photosynthesis to make food. Some kinds of autotrophs can make their own food without light, in the absence of light. And so they're not doing photosynthesis. They're making food in a little different way. And these kinds of organisms use energy that's stored in molecules, in chemical bonds. Remember we talked about how making a chemical bond can store energy, like when we talked about ATP, releasing the P, breaking that bond releases energy. Chemical molecules store energy in their bonds. And these kinds of autotrophs use the energy that's stored in those inorganic molecules. Remember when we talked about molecules, and organic molecules are molecules that have carbon in them. These would be inorganic molecules. They contain chemicals that maybe we'd find in rocks or soil. And they use those molecules, the energy that's in those molecules, to break those bonds and use the energy to make carbohydrates, just like plants do. They're making sugars. So let's make a vocab word that has to do with using other kinds of molecules rather than light to make food. When we did plants using light, photo is the light part. Photosynthesis uses light to make food. What do you think the word would be for using chemicals to make food? We can put those words together. Chemo means things has to do with the chemistry part. And synthesis, they're using chemicals, chemosynthesis, to make the food, the sugars that we need. Organisms that do that are kind of unique. They have a really cool kind of metabolism, different than other autotrophs. And they live in really hostile, harsh environments. Think places that other organisms might not want to live. Think volcano vents. If you've ever been out to the hot springs out in Wyoming, the Yellowstone Park, that have the geysers and all that heat underground, there are organisms that can live in those hot springs. Think marshy, salty, just icky places that other organisms can't live. And they don't need sunlight to do this. They may be down in the bottom of a volcano vent at the bottom of the ocean. They may be in a place where the sun doesn't reach, and they can still live there and make food using chemicals instead of light. We're going to come back and talk about these a little bit later in a couple chapters when we look more at classification and different kinds of organisms that are living on our planet. Okay, so the flip side of autotrophs is heterotrophs. And remember, we called heterotrophs consumers. We're getting energy from eating other organisms. And you learned some vocab. I know you know these words from way back in grade school, probably, or middle school. Describing the kinds of foods that different organisms, different heterotrophs, get their energy from. So organisms that only eat plants, think of grazers like elephants, giraffes, bunny rabbits. We call those herbivores. Herbivores eat plants. Organisms that eat only animals, think lions, tigers, coyotes, we would call those carnivores. And then we have some organisms that get energy from both kinds of food. They eat plants and animals. Bears would be an example of omnivores. How about humans? Where do most humans fit into one of those groups? Most humans eat both plants and animals. We are omnivores. There are some kinds of humans that are herbivores. What would those people be? That's right, those would be vegetarians, right? Or if you're a vegan where you only eat plants, you don't eat animals, then we would consider you an herbivore. But most humans are omnivores. We eat all kinds of foods. We have a couple more vocab words that you may be less familiar with, and they also have to do with ways heterotrophs get their energy. Some kinds of consumers eat dead things. They wander around in the ecosystem. They maybe find a dead body that either has died from a sickness or been injured or killed, or find remains of something that another animal hunted and killed and kind of left the leftovers behind. And these kind of, sometimes maybe we would call them scavengers. Things like crabs or earthworms are scavengers, mites, some snails. And we call these detritivores. Detritivores are organisms that feed on the remains of dead bodies. The other kind of organism that gets energy from dead organisms, they break down and absorb organic matter from things that have died, are the decomposers. And that includes things like bacteria and fungi. Notice both of these. If you well, let's backtrack a little bit. Take a peek at this little picture at the bottom here. This is a tree that has fallen over and died. And notice the little bracket fungi that are growing on the sides of the tree. What they're doing is putting out enzymes to break down the tree material, the dead tree, and then absorbing those nutrients, taking the nutrients from the tree and absorbing it through their surface. So both of these organisms, detritivores or scavengers and decomposers, are working to get their nutrients from dead things. The difference is detritivores actually have a mouth to eat those nutrients, to eat the food. They can wander around and pick up dead scraps. But decomposers are organisms that don't feed. They don't have a mouth, but they're still breaking down the nutrients that are in dead things. And both of these are really important members of ecosystems because they keep the nutrients cycling through an ecosystem. We're going to talk more about that a little bit later in our chapter. Okay, so if we think about how energy moves through an ecosystem, there's a series of steps. And remember, we talked about getting energy from the food you eat. So when you eat something, you're picking up the molecules and the energy that's stored in those molecules from another animal when you eat it. So if you think about, we talked about food chains, always start with a producer. Remember, energy from the sun is giving them power to do photosynthesis, like a green plant or a little flower in the picture here. And then some kind of an organism is going to eat the plant and receive the energy from that. So look at how the arrows are going. The arrows are showing you how the energy is flowing from the plant to the grasshopper that eats the plant. And then the mouse eats the grasshopper, so the energy flows into the mouse. And then the snake eats the mouse, so that energy is going to pass to the snake. And then the hawk eats the snake. So we have kind of what we call that a food chain. We're passing energy from the producers to the consumers when the food gets eaten. And that's called a food chain, right? A sequence, how it shows how energy moves through an ecosystem as things get eaten. And notice we have names for those kinds of the organisms in the food chain. Primary producers are always the beginning. Autotrophs, always the beginning of every food chain. They're the ones that are making the food from sunlight. And then the organisms that are herbivores, that eat the plants directly, are called primary consumers. The ones that eat the primary consumers are called secondary consumers. And then tertiary consumers eat the secondary consumers, and quaternary means four, quaternary consumers eat the tertiary consumers. Sometimes they're called levels, like level 1 consumers, level 2 consumers, level 3 consumers. You should be familiar with those vocab words and what they mean and where it puts you in an ecosystem if I say you're a tertiary consumer compared to a primary consumer. If you think about an ecosystem, though, we have way more complicated interactions than just a simple food chain, because organisms don't just eat one thing. So if you look at the little clapper rail bird in the picture here, notice the arrows coming into the bird. That means the bird is eating the food and getting the energy from those things. So sandhoppers are food for clapper rails. They eat plants, they eat grasshoppers. All of those things are supplying energy to the clapper rail when he eats it. So notice you have a lot more complicated interactions. And so linking all our food chains together make what's called a food web. And there are some pretty complex interactions between organisms in an ecosystem as things eat each other. Each step in the food web or chain is called a trophic level. So if we talk about those primary consumers, secondary consumers, or we call them first and second level consumers, each of those levels is called a trophic level. Look at the beginning of that word, that troph part. Where did we see that before? Think heterotrophs, autotrophs. It's describing how organisms feed and where they get their energy from. So trophic level, if you look at a food chain, remember producers are always on the first trophic level, way down at the bottom. And if you were to collect all the producers in an ecosystem and kind of put them in a little pile, and then collect all the first level consumers that are eating the plants and kind of put them together in a pile, what you notice is as you go up along in the food chain, that each level kind of depends on the level below it that's supplying the food. And as you go up and up in the food, along in the food chain, fewer and fewer organisms at that level, because it takes a lot of organisms at the level below to provide food for the next level up. So we have a lot more producers in an ecosystem than we have third level consumers. If you think about that idea, the lower levels have to be bigger to support the next level up. It's almost like a little pyramid. And really only about 10% of the energy on each level gets passed on to the next level. Most of the producers are going to stay in the ecosystem as producers. They're not going to get eaten. We don't eat all the plants in an ecosystem. There's just going to be a few that get eaten. And so of that energy that's in that level, only about 10% is going to get passed on to the next level up, and most of the energy is going to stay in that trophic level and be used by organisms to stay alive and do their thing, be all those life processes we talked about, like metabolism, all the chemistry that you're doing, transport, reproduction, growth, development, movement. Most of the energy is used for just being alive. And some of that energy that doesn't get used as for life processes or passed on when something gets eaten is lost as heat. Organisms make some body heat, and not all the energy that comes from the food that we eat gets captured as ATP. Some of that gets lost as heat. Some organisms make a lot of heat and use that heat to control their body temperature. Think humans. Remember, we talked about that homeostasis idea. When you go outside today, when it's 30 below, your metabolism is going to kick in. Your mitochondria are going to burn some more food for you and make some body heat to keep you warm. So we talked about some things that cells use energy for. As far as transport, active transport, remember, requires energy. In our last chapter, we talked about things that cells do that require energy. Movement, like moving chromosomes. Think sperm swimming with their little tails. We talked about cilia, flagella, making molecules, all the chemistry that's happening inside of you. Growth, development, reproduction, all of those life processes take energy, and it's coming from the food. That's the end of our slideshow. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more on ecosystems.